everybody. Thank you for joining Authors on the Air. I'm your guest host, Deborah Ledford, and I'm honored to feature bestselling author Noelle Ihli on the program today. Say hello to the folks, Noelle.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Deborah.
Oh, thank you for coming. I'm just so thrilled. I am so thrilled. My episodes for Authors on the Air primarily focus on Native American and Indigenous authors and also authors who feature Native characters in their books. Noelle, you're in the latter category and present a group of extraordinary Native characters in your latest release, None to Tell. None Left to Tell. Oh my gosh. I loved this book so much. Oh my gosh. Can you just give us a brief idea of None Left to Tell and the location and time frame to start?
Yes, absolutely. So None Left to Tell, it centers around the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which took place in southern Utah in 1857. And it was a crime perpetrated by religious zealots and local settlers that was scapegoated. Native people were scapegoated for the crime, and involved a whole lot of everyday people caught up in what ended up being one of the most horrific massacres in that era, that year. And it was covered up for a very long time, and a lot of false narratives came out of that crime, specifically centered on Native people. So it felt like a very important story for me to tell. My ancestors were involved in it, unfortunately, not in a great way, but it's a fascinating and horrific story in Utah history.
It is, and it's so brave for you to tell this story. And tell us again the year, the years that encompass.
1857 was when the massacre happened.
Right, right. And what is, I mean, not only the overall theme and the tragedy and shining light on it, but there are three distinct women's paralleling stories are presented, right? Each of these points of view are presented, which is, you did this so brilliantly. I mean, it's so brilliant. I felt such a deep bond and connection with all of the women. You know, they're living different journeys during the same time frame. Did you read? So I'm curious about how you put this together. Did you write one character's story at a time, or did you follow the timeline, one character followed by another for each of the chapters? How did you go about piecing each of these women's stories together?
Some parts of the book I wrote them where I would, stay with a timeline, or not a timeline, but a character's perspective. And then during editing, went back and moved some things around so they were interspersed with a different character's point of view. But for the most part, I did write, I wrote Katrina's perspective and then Sally's. And I wanted to feel kind of the emotion of that previous chapter as I went into the next, and showing the reader some of it was they were these very different people and cultures at this time, but they had so much in common, in that they were, everyday people who were being manipulated in a lot of senses by leadership, or were, they cared about their families, they cared about survival, they cared about so many of the same things, and yet they were treating each other as enemies, and doing some horrific things to each other. So it felt really poignant to be able to write one chapter after the next, and to be able to, it was jarring in a lot of ways to go from that, someone has just done a pretty horrible thing that will impact that next person. But it felt like I needed to feel that as I went to the next chapter in a lot of ways, to be able to pull that emotion through.
Right. And really, yeah. And to really show that. And, the actual journey of, between them all takes, time has to pass before something else it reveals itself. The prevalent theme throughout the book is we're nearly there. And that's just like, that is like perfect. And it works really for all three of these women's points of, storylines. how did you come up with this as the developing thing? And was that the developing thing, or is this something that I just kind of picked out and loved?
It makes me so happy that you picked it out and loved it.
Oh, good.
It was one of the, I feel like that's the way it is for all of my books. When I'll write the first draft and then I'll go back and read it and see those themes just under the surface that I want to raise up a little bit more, that were there all along, that were kind of a subconscious theme. So that we're nearly there. It just felt so, because I knew what was going to happen to
Right.
the settlers who were massacred, and to the women who were in these desperate situations, Sally and Lucy as well in some ways, but they didn't know that at the time. I needed to feel that hope of like, oh gosh, we're just, if we can hang on one more day, we'll be there, we'll get past this.
Right, right. So not only the journey of we're almost there, but we're almost there, the tragedy coming as well.
Yeah.
It was brilliant. I like to do that with my titles, meaning more than one thing. And certainly in none left to tell, your title in this also is a thoroughfare as well. So now, although none left to tell, it's considered a thriller. But it's much different than your other crime fiction novels. Was there something in particular that prompted you to write this particular book at this particular time?
Yes. That's a hard question for me to ask. I feel like in some ways this story has weighed on me for ever since I started learning more about what really happened. It was in the periphery of all of the stories I heard growing up about the pioneers coming to Utah and their heroic stories. And once in a while, there were little things mentioned about the conflicts and maybe some stories we didn't talk about. And they weren't stories we ever really told. And that was the faith I grew up with. I grew up Mormon, and that's no longer part of my life. But it wasn't until I was an adult, I was like, in my 30s, that I started learning about some of the stories that had just been on the periphery of the ones I had heard. And it was very sobering and sad and fascinating, and just consumed me for a long time, learning about, like, oh my gosh, like Hans Mill, where a bunch of Mormon settlers were killed by armed zealots, was not the only story out there. There were, there was a wholesale manipulation and massacre of many Native people. There were, this story about Mountain Meadows, where this religious zealotry burned so bright that women and children were slaughtered that, otherwise should have seemed to be friends with the settlers. And it felt like that had percolated for a really long time in the back of my mind. And I finally realized that I had a family connection to this story. The LDS Church exhumed the body of my great uncle, Proctor Robinson, to lay to rest some of these rumors that had circled around this story for a long time. That's its own complex story that I won't get into. It would take up all of our time.
Another book in itself, yes. I'm sure.
It's another book. And so that just sent me down some rabbit trails of research and trying to understand. And at the time, I'd written several books that were all contemporary thrillers, but this story just felt like it was both compelling in the way that a thriller will grab me, but it was also so true and so little known. And I couldn't find, when I tried to find accounts that were historical fiction or that had jumped a little outside of the nonfiction realm, I couldn't find them. And that made me really sad. It felt like a story that more people needed to be exposed to and understand, especially when so many of the stereotypes and the rumors and the just flat out fabrications about this event were still so prevalent.
Right. So go back a little bit with the native character, you're one of the female leads. I found it so respectful that you spelled out Sally's native Bannock name in each of her chapter headings, and thank you for that, because that, to me, that's, I mean, you really, all of your native elements for me as a native felt real and relevant and extremely respectful. And so how did you go about a little bit, of that particular research for that time frame for the Pi and with the Paiutes?
Yeah, and thank you. That means a lot to me to hear that. I I knew bringing in that perspective was going to be very important for this book. That perspective has been railroaded and intentionally silenced for throughout, this ever since this story began unfolding in real time in the 1850s. But obviously, I am a white woman. I needed to talk to. So I have a number of friends who had left left the faith I grew up in, Mormonism, that also had Native heritage. They are Native women. And so many of the stories about this came down through oral tradition. Their writing things down was dangerous, and
Right.
talking to them and piecing, okay, tell me what you know about this story and what you've heard about this story from your parents and your grandparents, and then listening to another person's, all of the different perspectives. And no one person possesses all of the knowledge ever in any of these stories, but it started to send me down the right path of, looking up at the resources that the Paiute Tribal Council had available in Utah and southern Utah, and what stories they had shared that were important to them about Paiute culture. And the Paiute tribe in Utah was primarily Southern Paiutes, were the tribe that were caught up in this tragedy most tightly. And so that was where I focused most of my research.
Right.
And then Sally Young Kanash, who was a young woman that was brought to Brigham Young's house under duress and had her
And
name.
that was real, right?
That is real, yes.
Wild.
Yeah,
Wild.
she was kidnapped and she was brought to his house and worked as a forced servant in his house. And yeah, she had her name changed, and she ended up being passed over to Chief Kanash as a sort of men's handshake and gesture of alliance between those two groups. And there's very few details about her story. It was unclear what actually even happened to her, how she died. There was a rumor that maybe one of Chief Kanash's other wives had actually killed her, but nobody knew. Her story just dropped off. And there were so many places in this story with women in particular, including Sally, including my relatives, including some of the women that were in the wagon train that were killed. The story always focused on the men, as is often the case in a lot of historical narratives. And so there was so much room there to research, but then also to wonder, who is this person in real life instead of a footnote? Who could this person have been?
Yeah, and storytelling is inherent in Native American and Indigenous, in our blood. Um, and it is true. I mean, the stories are told and told and told, but not written down. So, I mean, you have provided a legacy now that that's backed up by research, by your own blood, and I just appreciate so much that you have done this, and am so proud of you, because that's all of the research that you did. Oh my gosh. I mean, it must have been immense, and probably part of your life for a long time, not only reliving stories, I suppose, that were told over time for you, but how did you personally deal with the darkness during and after writing the novel? Was it difficult to release this to the world, and were you scared?
I was really scared.
I would
I
have been
was really
scared.
scared, and that's, I mean, it makes me tear up a little bit too, to have people receive it with the hopes that I had for the, you know, the somberness, but also the connection to the women in the book. That
Mhm.
means so much. And yeah, it was, there were a few different points during writing where I just had to step away for a couple of months at a time. When I got to the point in the book where I wrote about the massacre itself, there were just so many really horrific details swirling around, and it made it hard to figure out what to focus on and how to convey the gravity of what happened for everybody involved without, getting into just salacious or, over showing graphic different
Right.
crafty details. And it just felt like it was a lot of taking time to pet my cat and stare into the void and
Right. Right.
let different things settle.
Right.
Some of the books that I read about it were just, they were really dense. They were incredible researched. There were about 3 of them that I really delved into, and they're sitting on my shelf over there with just pink stickies all over them. But
Much
they,
like
you just
much
a
like
little.
I did with your book. I have a bunch of tabs and stickies, and just for all the things that I was like, oh, I can't forget about this. I know, and you're right, the research, it can be a lot, and um, but that's what makes it real. I mean, and it verifies maybe what you've had in your mind, and so are your relations, are your people happy that you've done this? Are they a little wary about it? How and if it's too personal, I completely understand. You
No,
okay.
it's not too personal. I had that in my head as I was thinking about the different real people who were descendants of this, that would then be reading this book potentially. And it
Right.
felt like that was a good kind of pressure on me to make sure that I didn't, when I started writing the book, I had a lot of anger towards my my ancestors
Sure.
who were part of this, but
And you'll find out why when you read the book.
yes. But I felt like, trying to really stretch into that empathy for especially the everyday people who, made some really sometimes hard to understand choices in modern light and in present day, looking back at what unfolded from their choices. That was hard, but it was also a good exercise for me. And I have been really pleased by my mother-in-law, who is just the
Ooh.
sweetest, most devout woman. She's read it twice, and
Oh,
she
nice.
had such kind things to say. It seemed, from what I could tell from her reaction, my mom's halfway through. I don't know. uh, we'll see what she has to say, but it was really touching to me to see that she felt like I had not leaned into the stereotypes that I
Right.
had the opportunity to
Right.
potentially. There's a
Right.
lot of anger from, especially when you're learning about a tragedy like this from whoever's
Right.
perspective you're
And the
in.
thing is, you don't take sides. You present all of the characters as real people going through what they had to do to survive. And you don't, and you brilliantly do this because, and I asked that question primarily because, it's the same thing essentially with my family growing up. My people are Eastern Band Cherokee, my mother's people, Western North Carolina. And it was a deep, dark secret that my grandfather's mother was full blood Cherokee, and nobody talked about it. I do not have the good stories or or memories of that woman. I mean, I spent all of my summers growing up in Western North Carolina and hanging out with my grandfather, and I just kicked myself for not asking this, and I'm sure were extraordinary stories. It was more sitting in the silence with my grandfather. But so you give us fascinating snippets of insights about LDS traditions and beliefs. Like, for instance, the holy garments and what the markings on that clothing mean. The information reminded me of Native American traditions and what should and shouldn't be shared by those, that are in the know. How did you decide how far to go with the LDS revelations?
That's a great question, and it's something that I really grappled with. I didn't want to disrespect anyone's sacred experiences, no matter who is in the story. I ended up choosing things that I could find on the LDS official church website. They might not be on the front page, but they are in published pamphlets, or they are in, if you want to search for the garments, you can find that at some point. And I tried to include those primarily in the perspective of the character and treat them with that character's care and sacredness of them. So anything that character would not have maybe been comfortable writing in a record that they knew might eventually be read, then I didn't include that, or anything that I thought I couldn't do justice explaining just a little bit, or that would just appear silly or ridiculous to an outsider. But would be understood by that inside group, I chose not to include.
Right. Yeah, and you don't go too far. I don't feel like there were any actual secrets revealed, but enough to interest people. I was like, oh, that is fascinating. I never knew that. But yeah, you spend a lot of time on the afterword, and just, it proves how much research you did on this, and I just wish you so very, very much the absolute best. We're going to wrap it up a little bit. It's a new release, None Left to Tell. How can we find you online, and do you have any appearances coming up?
Yeah, so you can find me. My website is Noelle W. Ihli, IHLI.com, or all of my books are available on Amazon and in many bookstores around the country. So I do a lot of signings locally in the Pacific Northwest in Idaho, but you can follow me on Instagram, and I am always posting if I have an appearance or a signing on social media there.
That's so great. Okay, well, keep writing out these fantastic books, but for now, everyone, spend your time on None Left to Tell, because you will be changed for the better in reading this. I think about this book a lot, and I so appreciate you joining us, Noelle, and you take care. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you. And thank you, Deborah. I appreciate it so much.
Absolutely. We'll see you next time.